All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're unpacking a really dense and fascinating piece of theology. It takes an ancient farming festival and uses it as a key to unlock one of the biggest questions we have. What happens when we die? We're going to see how a simple harvest offering was completely reimagined to explain the idea of resurrection.
So this is the big question at the heart of the text we're looking at. And, it sounds like a bit of a stretch, right? How on earth can a farming ritual from thousands of years ago tell us anything about the fate of all humanity? Well, as we're about to see, it all comes down to the incredible power of a metaphor.
And to really get it, we've got a clear roadmap. First, we'll look at the ancient harvest promise itself. Then, we'll see how that gets applied to Jesus as the first fruit. After that, we'll get into this cosmic drama called the Tale of Two Atoms, ask a really important question, why a man and not an angel? And finally, we'll land on what this text calls humanity's final transformation.
Okay, so first things first, before we can understand the main argument, we absolutely have to get our heads around the core metaphor. Everything else that follows is built on the foundation of this one ancient ritual. And this is it, the Feast of First Fruits, or Chosiljeol in Korean. The idea was actually pretty simple, but also really profound. When the barley started to ripen, you'd take the very first bundle, the first sheaf, and you'd offer it to God. This wasn't just a literal thank you for the food, it was a powerful, symbolic promise. It was like saying, here's the proof that the rest of it, the whole big harvest, is on its way. Now, the source material we're looking at takes this idea and blows it up into three huge cosmic stages, three great harvests. It starts with the Feast of First Fruits, which it directly links to Jesus' resurrection. Next comes Pentecost, which is seen as a kind of spiritual harvest, the gathering of believers. And it all culminates in the Feast of Tabernacles, which symbolizes that final ultimate gathering of everyone who is redeemed. So you can see, this sets up a pretty epic timeline. So let's see how this metaphor really starts to build. Because this is the core claim of the entire text, that Jesus' resurrection wasn't just some isolated miracle. No, it was the direct, literal fulfillment of the symbolism that was locked inside that ancient harvest festival all along. And the timing, apparently, is everything. The Feast of First Fruits was always celebrated on the day after the Sabbath. And of course, the Gospels say Jesus was resurrected on, you guessed it, the morning after the Sabbath. According to this text, that is absolutely not a coincidence. It's the moment the symbol became real. He is that ultimate first offering. And look, this isn't some new idea. The source text is leaning hard on this verse from 1 Corinthians. It's spelled out as clearly as it can be. Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, which is just a biblical way of saying the dead. This verse right here is the linchpin, the thing that directly connects that old farming festival to the idea of resurrection. So here's the takeaway. If Jesus is the first sheaf of grain from the harvest, what does that promise? Well, it promises that the rest of the harvest is coming. His resurrection isn't just about him. In this framework, it's the very act that guarantees, that makes the future resurrection of believers even possible. He is, as the source puts it, the first of the first fruits. Okay, so that brings us to this kind of epic, cosmic story that the text uses to explain why a resurrection was even necessary in the first place. It's a story about humanity's core problem and its ultimate solution, and it's framed as the tale of two atoms. It's a totally fair question, right? If you're going to have a solution this massive, the problem it's solving has to be just as big. And this text traces the problem all the way back to the very first human. And the contrast it draws is just incredibly stark. On one side, you've got the first Adam. He has what's called a soulish body. And through his failure, he's the one who brings sin and death into the world. He creates the problem. On the other side, you have the last Adam, Jesus. He's described as a life-giving spirit whose victory is the solution, bringing the promise of resurrection and life. It's a perfect symmetry. Death came through a man, so, the logic goes, life had to come through a man too.
Let's just quickly define what these terms mean. The soulish body, or hanjikin mom, that's us right now. It's our natural, physical, mortal body. But the goal, the thing you get through resurrection, is a spiritual body, a yongjikin mom. Now, the text is clear this isn't some wispy ghost. It's a transformed, real, but immortal and incorruptible body. Something more like what an angel would have. It's a total upgrade from mortal to immortal. Now, all of this raises a pretty obvious logical question. one that the source material actually anticipates and tries to answer head-on. If the whole point was to fix the human problem with the divine power, why do it this way? Why couldn't God just send a super powerful, perfect angel to come down and clean up the mess? Why did the Redeemer have to be human at all? Well, the text argues there's a very specific, almost legalistic logic to it. And here's how that logic breaks down. First, to be a kinsman redeemer, which was a real concept where a relative had the right to buy back a family member from slavery, the Redeemer had to actually be our kin. He had to be human. Second, to be a real example of overcoming temptation, he had to do it in a real, fragile human body. Third, and this is a big one, you can't conquer death if you can't die. An angel is immortal. It couldn't do it. And finally, to be the perfect bridge, the mediator between God and humanity, he had to have a foot in both worlds. So, to just put a bow on that argument, an angel was simply not qualified for this specific job. It couldn't be a relative, it couldn't truly face what we face, and most importantly, it couldn't defeat death from the inside out. So from this perspective, the Redeemer being human wasn't just some random detail, it was an absolute, non-negotiable requirement of the plan. Okay, so this brings us to the grand finale of this whole narrative. This is the payoff. After all this, what's the ultimate outcome for humanity? What does that final, complete harvest actually look like? Well, the solution that the last Adam brings is a perfect fix for the problem the first Adam created. His work opens up a path for the entire family tree of Adam, and that means all of us, to be redeemed and transformed, to be, as the text says, reborn. And here's what that looks like in practice. First, believers are redeemed, and then, in a really cool twist on the metaphor, they also become first fruits. They get to take part in what's called the first resurrection and receive that immortal spiritual body we talked about. And finally, their resurrection becomes the ultimate proof that God's way was the right way all along. But the source makes one last, really mind-bending point. It says the crucifixion and resurrection weren't just a patch to fix a broken world. No, it argues that the sacrifice on the cross is the thing that brings the entire act of creation to its final intended completion. It wasn't a repair job, it was the finishing touch. And that leaves us with one last pretty big idea to chew on. If an event that happened thousands of years after the beginning is what completes creation, what does that mean? It suggests that maybe creation wasn't just a single event in the past, but an ongoing process that needed this final, critical act to finally reach its true purpose. Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us.